We've reached a pretty radical point in American history when Democratic witnesses in front of Senate committees testifying about abortion cannot say that women are the only people who have babies. And yet that is precisely where we are. And it speaks to the ideological drip down that happens from academia into the halls of power and how that then drips down to the American people more broadly. Because you have to understand that the sort of radicalism that you're now seeing from the Biden administration, in which they proclaim that boys can be girls, girls can be boys, and that actual medical transition is a necessity for small children. When they say that sort of stuff, that is not coming from them. That is coming from the halls of academia, the ivory tower, where a bunch of people who are the intellectual oligarchy decide what the rest of us should think. And this has been the role of academia for a very long time. Academia, when it first began, was supposed to be the place where all the smartest people gathered and they thought about the world, and then they came up with rubrics and heuristics that we could use in order to understand the world. And it was supposed to be based on merit. It was supposed to be based on the merit of your ideas, the fact that you were very smart, the fact that your ideas were creative and interesting and tested and true. Research was supposed to be done at universities. It was supposed to be a place where civilization was built. And then in the 60s, academia essentially became a place where civilization was torn down. And at that point, legitimacy in academia should have fallen away. People should have stopped paying attention to the academics who were spewing absolute gobbledygook nonsense, unreadable jargon in academic papers that made no sense. And they should have said, okay, we just don't respect you anymore. You've lost your merit. Whatever merit you had as sort of the high IQ people who are supposed to rule from on high, which was always kind of a bad idea, whatever merit that idea had went by the wayside the minute you started spewing absolute nonsense. Instead, the academic elite, the oligarchic university institutions decided that in order to maintain their power, because the critique of them was that they were too powerful and too oligarchic, in order to maintain their power, instead what they would do is they would allow some people in who were radical criticizers of the system. They were going to allow the radicals to take over the building so they could maintain their own power. It was a pretty cynical move. They could have said to these folks, no, I'm sorry, your ideas do not merit to be in the upper tiers of academia because they're bad ideas. You don't have anything to teach the world. Instead, the critique was, you won't let us in because you are racist or because you are sexist. It's not because we have bad ideas, it's because you're racist or you're sexist. And so the halls of academia, which were, I think, immunologically compromised with this sort of stuff, they just didn't have a good response to it. So they said, okay, you guys come on in and you too can be part of the academic oligarchy. You too can be part of the intellectual elite that decide for the rest of us what truth constitutes and what facts constitute. That is the only way to explain why somebody like Khiara Bridges, a professor at Berkeley, is considered a public intellectual in the United States of America, spewing absolute nonsense with an extraordinary level of self-absorbed, narcissistic confidence. And it really is unparalleled. So there are a bunch of clips yesterday that went viral from a Senate committee hearing. The Senate committee hearing is the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they were talking about the overruling of Roe versus Wade under Dobbs. And Khiara Bridges was called by the Democrats in order to testify. And there are a few things to learn from this exchange, which was championed by the left, by the way. In this exchange, according to the entire media, Khiara Bridges is the victor. She is a wonderful expositor of humane values that have at their root deep eternal truths. This is according to the media. And Josh Hawley is getting skunked in these videos. Except that he's not. What she is spewing is absolute garbage. It is dumpster fire nonsense. And yet she's being treated as though she's a wise person. There's no wisdom in anything she's about to say. There's no fact in anything she's about to say. It is completely reality removed. And not only that, it is censorious. It is arrogant and nasty. And that is the nature of academic oligarchic institutions. They are oligarchies. They are tiny cadres of people who rule from above, which means they cannot allow dissent. If you wonder why it is that Ivy League colleges and universities, why these places are 98% Democrat, why there are no Republican professors in the halls of power, any conservatives in the halls of power, any natural law theorists in the halls of power, if there are, you can name them on one hand at all the Ivy League universities. That is because the oligarchy can only maintain its dominance by treating every form of dissent, every question as an actual threat. And then rolling the eyes. It's a teenage response. It's amazing. These are supposed to be the wisest people. They should have cogent responses to obvious questions. Instead, they engage in teenage eye rolling. All this leads up to the actual clips here because they really are, it's an amazing embodiment and distillation of just what our academic culture has become, which is why we need to blow it up entirely. It is not fixable. We need alternatives like University of Austin in Texas, led by friends of mine like Barry Weiss and Neil Ferguson. We need other alternatives out there. We need online education. We need to get people out of universities to teach this sort of garbage as though this garbage was some form of higher knowledge, as though it was Moses on the Mount. It's ridiculous. Okay, so we begin with Khiara Bridges. To understand, by the way, who Khiara Bridges is, you have to understand that Khiara Bridges is one of the most privileged people, educationally speaking, ever to walk this earth. Here is Khiara Bridges' actual academic background. Okay, she went to Spelman College. She then got a JD from Columbia Law School. She got a PhD from Columbia in anthropology, so she's a career academic. And she happens to be a classical ballet dancer, a trained classical ballet dancer. So this is not somebody who's experienced the deep, brutal hardship of American systemic racism. This is somebody who has really skimmed the cream from American life. I mean, on an educational level, that is the apex of academic achievement. She doesn't believe in the meritocracy, by the way, right? She thinks the meritocracy is a lie. So that means that she is one of the privileged, because if it's not about merit, then it's about privilege. So she's one of the privileged. And yet she spent her entire career, and this is the key, she has spent her entire career ripping on the United States, which is one of the reasons why she's so widely beloved in leftist circles. In fact, she studies, quote, race, class, reproductive rights, and the intersection of the three. She's the author of a book called Critical Race Theory, a primer. She's a self-described critical race theorist. She believes in the rejection of legal conventions. She's a lawyer, right? She's a lawyer who teaches at Berkeley Law School and rejects legal conventions, law is bad, and advocates in favor of the idea that, quote, racism is a normal feature of American society, not a deviation from an otherwise fair and just status quo, and that traditional liberal understandings of the problems of racism and how racism will be defeated ought to be rejected. Namely, treating people in colorblind fashion, trying to treat people as individuals, the meritocracy, all of that is not going to solve racism. Instead, you need deep systemic change. So she's an Ibram X. Kendi type, which means she's a pseudo-intellectual masquerading as a real intellectual. And she speaks the jargon, and she says all of the words. And because she does all these things, she is considered the alpha and omega of intellectual life in the United States. So you tell me whether this seems like this should be at the height of intellectual achievement in the United States. So we begin with a clip of Khiara Bridges talking with Senator John Cornyn from Texas. And he asks her a very simple question because they're talking about abortion. He says, does the life of a preborn child have any worth at all, in your view? Because she is an advocate of abortion all the way up to birth. And normally, Democrats have to have some sort of answer to this. But because she is an arrogant professor, she does not need to have an answer to this. In fact, it is her arrogance that just dismisses the question out of hand. She doesn't want to answer that question, so she won't. Here we go.
Do you think that a baby that is not yet born has value?
I believe that a person with a capacity for pregnancy has value. They have intelligence. They have agency. They have
I'm talking about the baby.
And I'm talking about the person with the capacity for pregnancy.
You're not answering the question. I'm asking.
I'm answering a more interesting question to me.
You think that the baby that is not yet born, let's say the day before his mother delivers, do you think that baby has value?
I think that the person with the capacity for pregnancy has value, and they should have the ability to control what happens to their lives.
Well, and I just note you refuse to answer the question.
Oh man, the contemptuous pomposity of this human being. It's an amazing thing. She's asked a very simple question. She says, well, I'm answering a more interesting question to me. Well, I wasn't aware that you get to answer your own questions when you testify in front of Congress. I thought, generally speaking, you're asked a question and then you answer the question. I mean, he asks her the value of a preborn human being. If she just starts giving a disquisition on the quadratic formula, that would not be answering the question, even if that is much more interesting to her. Who cares what's interesting to you? You weren't called here to talk about the things that are interesting to you. You're testifying in front of Congress. And of course, she's using exactly the sort of nonsensical gender ideology jargon that you're used to hearing from the left now. Remember, for years, when people on the right have talked about what's happening in academia, the typical response of so many people in the mainstream media and in the Democratic Party, and yes, even on the right, has been, why do we care what happens on campus? Why does it matter what happens on campus? After all, it's just a bunch of pointy heads who are talking with each other in echo chambers with a few hundred people. Why is that a big deal? And the answer is because this ideology bleeds down. It does. There is a trickle-down theory of intellectual nonsense. And that trickle-down theory happens to be correct. It starts at the top in places like Berkeley Law School, and then it drips down into every nook and cranny of American life. So what she is saying there is that people with the capacity for pregnancy. Now, the reason she's saying that, of course, is because the idea is supposed to be that there are some men who can get pregnant. Now, this is a nonsensical view. There is no such thing as a pregnant man. It does not exist. There are women who believe they are men who get pregnant. That does not make them men any more than a woman who believes she is a cat means that cats get pregnant with humans. That's not the way any of this works. A woman who is born female is still a woman, even if she believes she is a man. But because she is a devotee of the idea that men can be women and women can be men, an anti-biological, anti-logic, anti-physics position, considering that now the position of the left is that you have to go back in time and erase the fact that this person was ever a member of their biological sex. She doesn't give any evidence to this effect, but she doesn't have to. She can just use scorn and nastiness in order to achieve her point. And then she can wrap it up with a bow that says, I care. And that's exactly what happens in this now viral exchange with Josh Hawley. So Josh Hawley points to the fact that when she is talking about quote unquote women's rights, what she really means is not women, because she literally believes that men can give birth. And so he says, you keep saying things that people on the left can say women's rights. Well, it's not really a women's rights issue if men can give birth. So can men give birth? And she is the astonishing sententiousness of this human being. It's the dripping scorn is incredible. Here we go.
Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing that.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important
because of my line of questioning? So we can't talk about it?
Because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist
I'm
is
denying
dangerous.
that trans people exist by asking you if you're talking about women having pregnancies?
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can get
So you are
pregnant.
denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence? Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you?
Absolutely.
Or are they also treated like this? Where
No,
they're
they're
told
allowed
that they're
to question.
opening up people to violence?
We have a good
by
time in my
questioning.
class. You should join.
Oh, I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Wow, I would learn a lot. I've learned a lot just in this exchange.
Absolutely.
Extraordinary.
What an obnoxious, terrible human being. My goodness. And that's because she's never had to answer a difficult question, ever. She's filled with intersectional criteria, and she spouts intersectional woke nonsense. And that means that nobody's ever asked her a question. She's never had a PhD advisor who's forced her to answer a question. She's never had a student who's asked her a tough question that she hasn't been able to dismiss with the wide eyes and the rolling eyes and the gestures of disdain. She's never had to answer that sort of stuff because, again, it's an oligarchy, and oligarchy means you quash dissent. This is the sort of stuff that people face in the classroom, and it bleeds down. Her line is complete garbage, by the way. It is just sheer bullcrap. When she says, Josh Hawley, do you believe that trans people exist? Trans people exist in the sense that there are people who believe they are members of the opposite sex. This does not mean that their claim is accurate. Okay, schizophrenic people exist. This does not mean that the radio is talking to them. Trans people exist in the same way that anorexic people exist. There are people who believe that they are fat when they're actually underweight. This does not mean that they are actually fat. So you're not denying anybody's existence. You're denying that their claim about reality is true. But she suggests, of course, that this means that people are committing suicide. And this is always the threat that the left likes to bring. And it starts in academia. It bleeds all the way down. The idea is that if you make an argument based in fact that you're going to cause somebody else to commit suicide. Now, in American law, and in law typically, the idea that you can cause someone else to commit suicide is pretty dicey territory generally. And you actually have some pretty specific evidence saying that somebody is telling somebody to commit suicide in order to even attempt to hold them accountable for their commission of suicide, because there's an intervening actor, namely the person who's committing the suicide. The generalized point the left tries to make is that if you say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, a bunch of people who believe they are members of the opposite sex will be so despondent about the fact that biological reality exists and that you are saying it. Not even that it exists, that you're saying it, that they're going to go commit suicide. There's only one problem with this line of argument. It's complete nonsense. There's no statistical evidence to suggest that the wildly disparate suicidal ideation rate among LGBT people suddenly corrects itself to meet the cis norm, meaning people who know what sex they are and it is their biological sex, the heterosexual norm, that the suicide rates, the suicidal ideation rates, do not suddenly become equal if you live in an area that is highly tolerant of LGBT. they're still wildly disproportionate, which suggests that there are a bunch of other intervening factors, including serious comorbidities with regard to anxiety and depression that attend upon LGBT identity. We're not allowed to talk about any of that. The idea is supposed to be that it's because Josh Hawley is mean that trans kids are now suicidal. That is not true. There's no evidence to that idea. And by the way, even were that true, it would not mean that it is now Josh Hawley's job to lie. Truth matters in a society. If some people are unable to handle truth, and this causes them to be more mentally ill or more suicidal, that is not the fault of the truth. We're going to have to find some different solutions. The solution is not society-wide falsehoods. And yet that is exactly what is being promoted here, because, and yet the reason that this matters is because for people like Khiara Bridges, truth is non-existent. It doesn't exist. It's a mechanism of power. This is what critical race theory suggests, and she is a critical race theorist. Critical race theory exists within the broader framework of critical theory. Critical theory, which is a sort of Foucaultian invention, critical theory says that truth does not exist. Truth is merely power. It's a guise for power. What you think of as truth is just because you have grown up in a system in which that definition of truth was crammed down upon you by forces that use that particular definition of truth and that value of truth as a tool for power. So if we wish to correct the mechanisms of power imbalance, we have to redefine truth. We have to pretend truth away in order that the marginalized and the dispossessed can have more power. And if that means we all have to lie, then we all have to lie. And if it means that truth has to go by the wayside as a value, then truth has to go by the wayside as value, which raises the question as to why you are a professor. What exactly are you teaching? You're just teaching the destruction of all norms and institutions and all the wisdom does not exist in this world. Everything is relativistic. It is just a power game. And this is why Khiara Bridges treats everything like a power game. In that exchange, she's treating it like a power game. She's not interested in getting at the truth. She answers the questions she wants to answer because this demonstrates that she is standing up to the patriarchy. It demonstrates that she's overthrowing the power imbalances inherent in the dynamic. When she decides that she is just going to accuse Senator Hawley of facilitating suicide without any actual evidence to that effect, well, I mean, that's all part of the game. Because it is a game. It's a power game because everything is a power game. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?